The question of whether the United Nations, UN, is fit for purpose has been a subject of extensive debate. Established in 1945, the UN's primary objectives include maintaining international peace and security, promoting human rights, fostering social and economic development, and upholding international law. While the organization has achieved notable successes, it has also faced significant criticisms and challenges that question its effectiveness in fulfilling its mandate. Leaders from BRICS nations have articulated critiques of the United Nations, particularly concerning its structure and effectiveness. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva emphasized the need for UN reform during his address at the UN General Assembly in September 2024. "We need a revised UN Charter that gives a stronger inclusive role in global peace, acknowledging the unjust exclusion of Latin America and Africa from permanent Security Council seats." Russian President Vladimir Putin, during the BRICS summit in October 2024, underscored the importance of BRICS as an alternative to Western-dominated institutions. The BRICS nations are committed to promoting a more just world order, countering the dominance of a unipolar world. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has consistently advocated for UN Security Council reforms. In a statement at the BRICS summit, he remarked, "The UN must reflect the realities of the 21st century. India, with its billion-plus population and democratic credentials, deserves a rightful place at the UN's top table." China's President Xi Jinping, addressing the BRICS summit, called for a multipolar world order. "International affairs should be handled by all of us, and the rules set should be jointly written by all countries. The UN needs to reform to reflect this collective approach." President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa criticized the UN Security Council's effectiveness during the BRICS summit. "We see from many conflicts across the world that the UNSC has not fulfilled its mandate to maintain international peace and security. It does not represent the interests of the global community." Former Indonesian President Joko Widodo, during the 75th UN General Assembly in September 2020, called for UN reforms. "The United Nations must reform itself, revitalize multilateralism, and become more responsive to current and future challenges." Structural issues within the UN have often been criticized. The UN Security Council's composition, granting veto power to 5 permanent members, often leads to decision-making paralysis, especially when these nations' interests are involved. This structure has been criticized for being outdated and unrepresentative of current global power dynamics. The United States, as one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, possesses veto power, enabling it to block the adoption of any substantive resolution. This authority has been exercised on numerous occasions, particularly concerning resolutions related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, leading to criticisms of misuse and hindrance to international consensus. Since 1970, the US has employed its veto power at least 34 times to block UNSC resolutions critical of Israel. This pattern has drawn scrutiny, with allegations that such actions impede the Council's ability to address issues in the Middle East impartially. A notable instance occurred in February 2011 when the US vetoed a draft resolution condemning Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories. The resolution, which labeled the settlements as illegal and an obstacle to peace, garnered support from the other 14 Council members. The US justified its veto by expressing concerns that the resolution might harden positions and hinder peace negotiations, despite acknowledging that settlement activity violated international law. More recently, in November 2024, the US vetoed a UNSC resolution calling for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire in Gaza. The resolution, supported by 14 out of 15 Council members, sought to halt hostilities and facilitate humanitarian aid. The US opposed the resolution, citing the absence of provisions for the release of hostages held by Hamas and concerns that an unconditional ceasefire might embolden the group. In addition to cases involving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there are other instances where the United States has been criticized for its use of veto power, often aligning with its geopolitical and strategic interests. In 1981, the US vetoed a resolution that called for imposing economic sanctions against apartheid-era South Africa for its continued occupation of Namibia. Critics argued that the US decision was motivated by Cold War considerations, as South Africa was perceived as a regional ally against Soviet influence in Africa. In 1986, the US vetoed a resolution condemning its military intervention in Nicaragua and calling for the cessation of support for the Contra rebels. This veto came amidst global criticism of US actions, including a ruling against the United States by the International Court of Justice, ICJ, for violating Nicaraguan sovereignty. In 2002, the U.S. vetoed a resolution seeking to extend the mandate of a peacekeeping mission in Bosnia and Herzegovina, tying its opposition to the ICC's jurisdiction. The veto was part of a broader U.S. effort to secure immunity for its citizens from ICC prosecution, reflecting its stance against the court's perceived potential to target American military and political personnel. In 2018, following the U.S. decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, a resolution was introduced to nullify the recognition. The U.S. vetoed this resolution, standing alone as the sole dissenting member of the Security Council. The veto was widely condemned, with critics arguing that the U.S. action violated international consensus and exacerbated tensions in the region. Broader critiques of U.S. veto use include accusations of selectively shielding allies from accountability, undermining its broader stance on human rights. Frequent vetoes on resolutions with near-unanimous support isolate the U.S. diplomatically and raise questions about the UNSC's ability to act as a neutral arbiter in international conflicts. Critics argue that the U.S. often uses the veto as a tool to advance its geopolitical interests rather than uphold the UN Charter's principles of maintaining peace and security. In light of these challenges, there is an ongoing debate about the UN's relevance in addressing contemporary global issues. Critics argue that without significant reforms, particularly concerning the Security Council structure and the organization's bureaucratic processes, the UN may struggle to effectively fulfill its mandate in the 21st century. Proposals for reform include expanding the Security Council to be more representative, improving transparency and accountability mechanisms, and enhancing the efficiency of its operations. The United Nations has faced several controversies over the years stemming from its decisions, actions, and projects. For example, the Oil for Food program, established from 1996 to 2003 to allow Iraq to sell oil in exchange for humanitarian aid during sanctions, became embroiled in corruption. Investigations revealed that Iraqi officials manipulated the system, leading to illicit profits and kickbacks involving companies and individuals from various countries. The scandal tarnished the US's reputation and highlighted significant oversight failures. The failure to prevent genocides, the UN's inability to act decisively in certain historical and ongoing crises has significantly tarnished its credibility. Below are examples where the organization fell short in its duty to protect vulnerable populations, including the ongoing plight of the Palestinian people. The Rwandan genocide in 1994. The Rwandan genocide remains one of the dark chapters in UN history. Despite advanced warnings from field commanders like Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire, who led the UN assistance mission for Rwanda, the organization failed to respond effectively. Over 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were massacred in just 100 days while UN peacekeepers were constrained by an inadequate mandate and insufficient resources. The international community, including the UN Security Council, hesitated to label the crisis as genocide, delaying crucial interventions and humanitarian aid. The Srebrenica massacre in 1995, the massacre of over 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys in Srebrenica, Bosnia and Herzegovina, occurred under the watch of UN peacekeepers. Despite declaring Srebrenica a UN-protected safe area, the peacekeepers were outnumbered and lacked the authority and resources to prevent Bosnian Serb forces from overrunning the enclave. The UN's failure led to widespread criticism and the eventual acknowledgement by Secretary-General Kofi Annan that the organization had failed to protect the victims. The case of Palestine, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has persisted for decades, with the UN often accused of failing to address the systemic oppression and humanitarian crisis faced by Palestinians. Despite numerous UN resolutions, including Resolution 242 from 1967, which calls for the withdrawal of Israeli forces from occupied territories, and Resolution 194 from 1948, affirming the right of Palestinian refugees to return, implementation has been lacking. The UN's inability to prevent the expansion of Israeli settlements, deemed illegal under international law, has exacerbated tensions. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is dire, with repeated conflicts, blockades, and limited access to essential resources leaving over 2 million people in a state of perpetual crisis. In recent years, the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East has faced funding shortages, undermining its ability to provide basic services like education, healthcare, and food assistance to Palestinian refugees. The UN's perceived double standards, with repeated US vetoes of resolutions critical of Israel in the Security Council, have led to accusations of bias and inaction. Sexual abuse by peacekeepers. Allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse by United Nations peacekeepers have significantly undermined the credibility of the organization's missions and raised serious concerns about accountability and oversight. These incidents have surfaced in multiple countries, notably the Democratic Republic of Congo, Haiti, and the Central African Republic, and have revealed systemic failures within UN operations. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse by peacekeepers date back to the early 2000s. Despite the establishment of an office within the UN mission in the DRC specifically to address these allegations, reports of misconduct persisted. This issue resurfaced in October 2023, when 8 UN peacekeepers were detained over claims of sexual abuse. The UN's mission in the country, MONUSCO, responded by announcing measures to address these serious accusations. Yet, such actions underscored long-standing failures to prevent abuse. Similarly, in Haiti, UN peacekeepers have been implicated in numerous cases of sexual exploitation and abuse, including the exploitation of vulnerable populations. This misconduct has further fueled criticism of the UN's ability to ensure proper oversight and accountability within its missions. The Central African Republic has also been a focal point of concern. Multiple reports of sexual violence committed by peacekeepers have emerged, with victims recounting harrowing experiences, including threats and assaults by those mandated to protect them. Since 2015, over 700 alleged sexual exploitation and abuse cases have been reported in the Central African Republic, with many more likely going unreported. These incidents paint a troubling picture of systemic abuse within UN operations. A key challenge in addressing these issues lies in the UN's jurisdiction limitations. While the organization can investigate allegations, legal accountability primarily rests with the troop-contributing countries. This often results in inconsistent disciplinary actions and, in many cases, impunity for perpetrators. Systemic issues such as inadequate national laws on sexual abuse, cultural and political resistance, and failures by the UN to effectively monitor compliance with its standards exacerbate the problem. In response to these challenges, the UN has implemented various policy reforms. Measures such as vetting personnel for prior misconduct, enhancing training, and establishing support mechanisms for victims have been introduced. Resolution 2272, adopted by the UN Security Council in 2016, aims to prevent sexual exploitation and abuse by individuals under UN mandate and strengthen accountability. Efforts to prioritize victim assistance have also been made, although challenges remain in ensuring adequate support and protection for survivors. Despite these initiatives, sexual exploitation and abuse by UN peacekeepers continue to tarnish the organization's reputation and hinder its ability to effectively carry out its missions. Addressing this pervasive issue requires a comprehensive approach that includes strengthening accountability mechanisms, ensuring consistent enforcement of policies across all missions, and fostering a culture of zero tolerance for misconduct within peacekeeping operations. Until these systemic issues are resolved, the UN's credibility and moral authority will remain under scrutiny. Over the years, many nations have voiced significant frustrations with the United Nations, criticizing its structure, policies, or decisions, and in some cases hinting at disengagement. Yet, despite these grievances, no member state has ever enacted a complete and formal withdrawal, underscoring the complexity and consequences of such a move. A notable historical instance occurred in 1965 when Indonesia declared its withdrawal from the UN in protest against Malaysia's inclusion as a non-permanent member of the Security Council. This decision was rooted in broader regional disputes, including tensions over the formation of Malaysia and concerns about perceived favoritism within the UN. However, the UN did not formally acknowledge Indonesia's withdrawal, and the country rejoined in 1966 following Suharto's ascent to power. This episode is often characterized as a temporary hiatus rather than a full withdrawal, highlighting the intricate dynamics behind such decisions. In more recent years, other nations have similarly expressed frustration with the UN but stopped short of taking concrete action. For example, in 2016, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte threatened to withdraw from the UN following the organization's criticism of his administration's controversial anti-drug campaign, which involved thousands of extrajudicial killings. Duterte accused the UN of exceeding its mandate and meddling in domestic affairs. However, despite his harsh rhetoric, the Philippines remained a member of the UN, underscoring the logistical and political challenges associated with leaving a global institution of this magnitude. This video delves into the growing calls from BRICS nations and countries in the global south to push for substantial reforms within the UN or, in some cases, to explore alternatives to the organization altogether. We examine the motivations driving this movement, the challenges these nations face, and the potential impact such actions could have on global governance. Countries in the global south, particularly BRICS nations, have escalated demands for sweeping reforms in the UN structure. Collectively, BRICS nations account for over 40% of the global population and approximately a quarter of global GDP, a proportion that continues to rise. However, the distribution of power within the UN, especially in the Security Council, remains tied to mid-20th century realities. The 5 permanent members with veto power, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China, dominate the Council's agenda, overseeing key decisions on peacekeeping, sanctions, and international security. Despite Africa having 54 member states, constituting nearly 28% of the UN membership, none hold permanent seats on the Council. The United Nations was founded in 1945 in the aftermath of World War II to succeed the League of Nations. 51 nations signed its charter in San Francisco, committing to prevent future conflicts, advance human rights, and foster global progress. The Security Council, with 5 permanent members wielding veto power, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, now Russia, France, and China, reflected the wartime victors' dominance. Critics argue this structure enshrined an outdated balance of power, undermining the principle of sovereign equality. The General Assembly, encompassing all members, was relegated to passing non-binding resolutions, leaving substantive decisions to the great powers. From its inception, the UN was constrained by Cold War rivalries. Peacekeeping missions were often ad hoc and hampered by vetoes, while specialized agencies like the World Health Organization and UNICEF earned acclaim for their humanitarian efforts but faced accusations of serving the interests of major donor nations. The Cold War era and decolonization of the mid-20th century saw a surge in UN membership as newly independent states from Africa and Asia joined, adding to the General Assembly's diversity. However, the Security Council's structure remained frozen in 1945, sidelining these new members from key decisions. Peacekeeping missions, such as those in Congo during the 1960s, aimed to stabilize conflict zones but were often undermined by insufficient mandates and funding. Meanwhile, the decolonization process turned the UN into a platform for emerging nations to challenge Western dominance. Nevertheless, the institution's core mechanisms continued to reflect the power dynamics of its founding members. The end of the Cold War sparked optimism about the UN's potential. The 1990s saw a surge in peacekeeping missions in regions like Cambodia, Somalia, and the Balkans. However, these missions often faltered, as evidenced by the UN's inability to prevent atrocities in Rwanda and Srebrenica. These failures highlighted structural flaws, including sluggish decision-making and insufficient resources. Calls for reform, particularly to expand permanent Security Council seats for rising powers like India, Brazil, and African nations, gained traction but faced resistance from veto-wielding members unwilling to dilute their influence. At the same time, unilateral actions like the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003 bypassed the UN, raising questions about its relevance in addressing global challenges. Despite adopting broader peacekeeping mandates, UN missions continue to grapple with limited budgets, constrained troop commitments, and the threat of vetoes. Allegations of misconduct, including sexual abuse by peacekeepers, have damaged the UN's credibility. Development initiatives like the MDGs and SDGs, while ambitious, are criticized for being underfunded and top-down in approach. The UN's partnerships with Western-dominated institutions like the IMF and World Bank further reinforce perceptions of bias and inequity. Observers from the Global South frequently highlight double standards in international governance. They argue that non-Western nations face disproportionate scrutiny for human rights violations, while Western countries and their allies often escape comparable censure. Disparities in refugee policies, such as the EU's preferential treatment of Ukrainian refugees compared to those from the Middle East and Africa, further underscore these biases. BRICS nations have long criticized their underrepresentation in global financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank. Despite their growing economic contributions, their influence in these institutions remains limited, with decision-making power concentrated in Western hands. Efforts to create alternatives, such as the BRICS-led New Development Bank, reflect frustration with the slow pace of reform in these legacy institutions. To address the inequities, proposals include expanding the Security Council, enhancing regional representation, and granting greater influence to non-Western nations. As BRICS countries advocate for systemic changes, resistance from established powers risks driving the formation of parallel frameworks that could challenge the existing global order. The United Nations, established with the noble goal of maintaining international peace and security, has repeatedly failed to fulfill its mandate in critical global conflicts. The organization's inability to address crises effectively is rooted in structural flaws, particularly the veto power wielded by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council: China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. This veto power has rendered the Security Council's decisions biased, driven more by the interests and benefits of these members than by a genuine commitment to global peace. From the Rwandan genocide to the Palestinian crisis, from the Syrian civil war to the persistent instability in Yemen, the UN's response has been characterized by inaction, paralysis, or selective intervention. Time and again, the Security Council has been reduced to a battleground of geopolitical rivalries rather than a forum for impartial conflict resolution. The veto power has allowed permanent members to shield allies from accountability, block resolutions aimed at curbing violence, and prevent the Council from taking unified action in the face of grave humanitarian crises. This self-serving mechanism not only undermines the Council's credibility but also erodes trust in the UN as a whole. The failure of the UN to act decisively is not merely an institutional shortcoming, it has real-world consequences. Millions of lives have been lost, countless others displaced, and entire nations destabilized as the Security Council remains mired in gridlock. While the world grapples with unprecedented challenges, including climate change, pandemics, and rising geopolitical tensions, the UN's structural weaknesses make it ill-equipped to offer the solutions the global community so desperately needs. In this context, the emergence of BRICS and the Global South as potential challenges to the status quo brings a glimmer of hope. These coalitions represent nations that have often been sidelined in global decision-making processes, yet they bear the brunt of the UN's failures. If BRICS and the Global South can unite to push for comprehensive reforms, including limiting or eliminating the veto power, expanding representation in the Security Council, and holding all member states equally accountable, they may succeed in reshaping the UN into a more equitable and effective organization. The time for reform is now. Without fundamental changes, the UN risks becoming increasingly irrelevant, a symbolic institution incapable of addressing the pressing issues of our time. The world cannot afford to let the interests of a few nations dictate the fate of billions. The call for a more inclusive, just, and functional United Nations must be answered, not just for the sake of the institution, but for the future of global peace and stability. We must wait and see whether the voices of BRICS and the Global South can rise to this challenge, but the need for change is clear and urgent. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching.